And with that, let's get things moving. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Lucie Mattera, Secretary General at ChargeUp Europe, the leading industry association representing the electric vehicle charging infrastructure sector across the continent. Their mission is clear: support the rollout of a consumer-centric, investment-friendly EV charging ecosystem. Today, Lucie will present the latest State of the Industry report, an annual snapshot of the European EV charging market. This report compiles vital data and trends that directly benefit charge point operators, providing actionable insights on infrastructure growth, policy developments, interoperability, and investment dynamics across Europe. Good morning, Lucie.
Hi, Cara. How are you?
Good. Lucie, when you say or hear the words electric mobility in Brussels, which is where you are based, people are jumping with excitement, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, look, the truth is that this is a discussion that is not in a very happy place today. And one of the reasons for that is because you have a lot of number pollution, which is why a product like the State of the Industry report can make such a meaningful contribution. It is full of data, full of insights to drive an informed political discussion and evidence-based decision-making.
Okay, and we will look at that industry report right now, or you will look at it and show us. So, Lucie, EV charging infrastructure, Quo Vadis, ChargeUp Europe's State of the Industry. The digital stage is yours.
Thanks, Cara. So good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the data and insights from our State of the Industry report, the 2025 edition, which is looking at key development into the European EV charging industry that took place last year. For those who do not know yet, the State of the Industry report, it is the flagship publication of ChargeUp Europe, which is the voice of the EV charging infrastructure industry. What I'm going to share with you today is about 10% of the full report, but you can, of course, check the full edition. It is already live on our website, and I will also be sharing a link with you at the end of the presentation. I want to be completely transparent that I am about to unleash a deluge of data on you. Before I do that, I want to be sharing two good things about the report. The first is that it is a report about the EV charging infrastructure industry by the EV charging infrastructure industry. So companies who are actively building the industry today that appear on the screen, who are the member of ChargeUp Europe. So you're going to find, as you can see, charge point operators, hardware producers, mobility service providers, roaming platforms, etc., etc. All right. So it's not a report by, let's say, some random consultancy. It's really a report by people active in the sector. The report draws on research that we have commissioned, independent research that we have commissioned, the insight of the EV charging companies that you see on this slide, and an internal survey of the membership, and I will be presenting some of those results in a few minutes. And as Secretary General of ChargeUp Europe, it's been my pleasure and a great privilege to be working with the members on this report. Here is the second good news about the State of the Industry. It is free. Yes, there's not many things that are still free in this world. It is free. You can already download it today on our website. Okay. Now let's get started. This is the table of content that we have for the State of the Industry, right? So it's a report that looks at EV uptake, public charging, private charging, the user experience, the HTV segment, integration with energy system, also the contribution of our sector to Europe's economy. So if you have an interest in any of the topics that you see listed on the screen, I encourage you to have a look at the report and see what our members have to say about it. Now, I'm going to start quickly with where I think the headspace is today in the industry, which is demand, right? So EV uptake and projections and forecast. So I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't know already. 2024 wasn't necessarily the best year for new EV registration. I think we all know that. But what you see on the slide is also a useful reminder that even if 2024 was a little bit slower, the long-term trends towards electrification remains very clear, right? So today, EVs make up about 4% of the total fleet in the EU. This is a number that's going to rise to around 30% by 2035, representing approximately 80 million EVs on EU roads in about a decade. With BEV, as you can see on the slide, by far the leading technology. That said, there's a lot of thinking that is going on with EU policymakers, who are the primary stakeholders of ChargeUp Europe, on how to sustain EV demand, how to improve EV volumes. And this year, EU institutions will be looking particularly at how to green corporate fleets. Why? Because corporate fleets represent, the largest share of registration of new cars, but they are actually lagging behind private cars on electrification, which is a little bit odd, right? So last year, ChargeUp Europe commissioned some research to AFRI because we wanted to be able to understand a question. We wanted to understand how many extra EVs we would see on EU roads if corporate fleets electrified at the same speed as private cars. And what you see on this slide is just one shot from the modeling that we received from that research. Just taking the German market, if corporate fleets electrified at the same speed as private cars, you would have an extra 5 million BEV on German roads, including 3 million second-hand cars, right? So lots of potential for electrification here. And as ChargeUp Europe, of course, this is going to be one of the priorities of our work for the year. I am now going to be sharing with you a short selection of data points focused on public charging for starters. And so what you will see emerging from the data in the report is really a picture of momentum, right? So public charging infrastructure has really been expanding very rapidly. At the end of 2024, so last year, we had around 850,000 public charging points in the EU. Right, so just a quick note, this is for EU 27 countries, not Europe, just EU 27. And out of those, that pale blue layer that you see at the top, which is DC charging point, you can see that the expansion of that particular technology has been particularly strong. Which brings me to the state of play of public EV charging infrastructure deployment across the EU, and the incredibly fraught political discussions around that. Now, I don't know how much of that political discussion you are perceiving today in your companies, but if I got 10 euros every time a policymakers tell me there's not enough public charging infrastructure available, I would have reimbursed my mortgage by now. So there is really this widespread and very persistent misconception that the sector is not deploying. The data doesn't support that, as you can see very clearly on this chart. It is worth noting that there is a piece of EU legislation, which is called AFIR, which prescribe the minimum level of public charging infrastructure deployment that is required to welcome the expected EVs by the end of the decade and beyond. And that target is set by the EU framework at 1.3 kilowatt per BEV. And that's the black line that you see on the chart. What the market has delivered, what the sector has delivered, is the blue line that you see on the chart, which is 5.7 kilowatt per BEV at the end of 2024, right? In other words, the sector has vastly outperformed the prescribed target set in AFIR by exactly a factor of 4. Okay, so we're going to be using that particular data point to counter some of those misperceptions about the lack of data, the lack of public charging infrastructure. In fact, if you look at power dispense, which is actually the more relevant metric when you're trying to assess if EV uptake and charging infrastructure development are moving in sync. So if you look at power dispensed, what we see is that DC charging deployment is actually outpacing BEV uptake today in many markets, including large markets such as France or Italy. Another notable trend we looked at in the report is HPC deployment. And again, what is emerging is really a picture of acceleration across the EU with, some regional variations, obviously, as always. But what you can see on this chart is the growth rate of high-power charging across the 27 member states of the EU. And maybe some of that data will surprise you, right? So you can see, at the bottom part, which is where we've seen the strongest growth, what you see is the Baltic countries performing very strongly, together with Romania or Luxembourg. So not necessarily countries that we think as frontrunners on EV charging. And yet, even in those markets, there is actually a lot of development that is going on. So that's a quick tour from essentially a CPO perspective. But what we also want to understand is how things are changing for EV drivers too, all right? So what you see on screen is a result from the internal survey to our membership that I mentioned. And it's just to give you a sense of what's happening on some of the networks of our CPOs. So in terms of how EV drivers pay today when they charge on a public network, what we see is that the majority of EV drivers still prefer to pay with their MSP contract. And it's interesting because there's, AFIR, the EU regulation that I mentioned, came into force last year, and it prescribes that networks should offer ad hoc payment methods for fast charging. The payment method has remained pretty stable over time. Staying with the EV driver and the user experience, a quick zoom on how the ChargeUp Europe members feel about automatic authentication, so plug and charge and auto charge. Again, this is coming from the internal survey that we ran with our membership a few months ago. And so you can see that there is interest in exploring these technologies, but that there's still a fairly large share of members who are a little bit undecided today. If you're still with me, we're going to have a super quick introduction to the HTV section, starting with demand. So we have around 25,000 e-trucks on e-roads today, which is not a lot, but that's going to go up very, very quickly. By 2035, we're looking at 1 million e-trucks hitting EU roads. In terms of zero emission technology that our members think will underpin the decarbonization of the HGV segment, what the ChargeUp Europe members widely see as the future is BEV. Other technologies that were tested in our survey are seen more as niche solutions with more limited market potential. Quick word on the preference for charging power for eHDV in the membership. So you can see a little bit of dispersion across the options, but about 2/3 of the ChargeUp members have a preference for fast charging. That is the chart on the left. And regarding dispenser solution, which is the chart on the right, the preference within the ChargeUp Europe membership is clearly for a combined system. I will say now just a few quick words about energy and energy system, starting by reminding everybody that we as a sector are not going to break the grid, right? Which is also one of those misconceptions that are floating around. So by 2035, demand from EVs will account for about 4% of total electricity demand in the EU, which is actually a very, very small number, much smaller than what most people imagine. Now, interestingly, that electricity demand will mostly come from private charging. And that's good news because this is where the greatest potential lies for flexibility, for grid balancing, for innovative solutions to the benefits of both the grids and the user. Benefits that are described in great details on this slide. I'm not going to list them all, but essentially, when you're looking at reducing energy costs, preventing capacity overload, reducing price fluctuation, etc., etc. This is a slightly more concrete way of talking about those benefits, looking at the case study from one of our members today. So this member has developed a smart charging algorithm, and it's very visual, right? You can see on the slide that shift the charging load away from peak demand periods to distribute it throughout the nighttime hours. And again, you can see that clearly on the chart. And that is, by the way, a good example of another type of information you're going to find in the State of the Industry report, which is case studies that we have selected with the members to showcase the innovative solution that we are deploying today and the value that is being created. We have about 20 of those in the report. Another really concrete example of benefits that the sector is bringing to the grid and to users. This one is a bit more focused on savings and the benefits to the end user. So this member that appears on screen has developed a peak off-peak optimization system that is deployed in French condominiums. And they have managed to increase off-peak hour consumption from 35% to 80%, allowing users to save about 120 euros per year. I want to take quickly a step back, look at the broader, more systemic geopolitical picture, because we're so good as a sector at integrating with energy system, which can be green, which can be locally produced. We are also contributing to Europe's energy security. Now, in 2023 alone, EVs in Europe displaced about 66 million barrels of oil, allowing the EU to save around 5 billion euros that year. So more and more, when we talk to EU policymakers, especially those who are concerned that EU car makers are struggling their electrification journey, who are skeptical of the energy transition, we're highlighting how the EV charging sector is actually making already today the EU more resilient, stronger in a geopolitically unstable environment through more resilient energy system. And I want to finish on a bright and positive note with one good piece of news, which is the value that is going to be created within the EV charging sector by 2035. And so what you can see is that we're going to be bringing 94 billion euros to Europe's economy by that time. And if that's a number that is very abstract for you, it is roughly the GDP of Luxembourg. Okay, so essentially we're going to be adding another European economy to the continent. Voilà. As I said, this is just a super quick tour of the report. The report went live around, about an hour ago. If you use the QR code that appears on the screen, you will be directed straight to the report, which, as I said earlier, is available for free, right? Have a look, enjoy it, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact ChargeUp Europe. We'll be happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucie. I have questions, as always. Thank you so much for your presentation. What do you say is the most significant shift or trend in the Europe's EV charging landscape when you look at the past year?
I think growth and momentum is really what is. I'm only sharing, a small part of the report. But if you look at, the broader slide that are already available, you can see how very quickly the sector has developed and matured and how much it has deployed. This is all backed by an enormous amount of investment right? And that's something I think that's a little bit lost sometime in the conversation. And it's really important to understand that it's a sector that in 2025 is not where it was 5 years ago. So it's a discussion, when you talk about the EV charging sector, always make sure you have the most recent data, because people who are talking about EV charging sector from 5 years ago are essentially, 5 years ago for us is last century, essentially. It's so far back in how we have developed and expanded over that period. It barely has any grounding in reality today.
So I said you're based in Brussels. When I think Brussels, I think policy. Are there any policy gaps or inconsistency across member states that the industry should be particularly aware of?
There's many. First of all, even if we're talking about the EU, what the EU is still very much 27 different fragmented national market. And that's a problem for an industry like the EV charging industry, because a lot of the members, that we have within ChargeUp, they're no longer startups, but they're scale-ups, right? And so when you have fragmentation that drives up costs, it makes things harder for them to be efficient, to be focusing on deploying. Instead, they have to overcome fragmented regulatory landscape, and that's really a concern. Beyond that, what we're facing a lot is essentially a lot of legacy regulations, so, regulation policy frameworks that were developed maybe 20 years ago, and that would be fine for any other sector. But we see a lot of those legacy frameworks that have not aged well, in particular around energy regulation that's particularly outdated today. So there's that maturity of the sector that isn't yet reflected in some of the framework that still govern the EU today.
And you said the EU is obviously 27 different markets. Are there any markets or countries that are really standing out, that really lead the way in terms of infrastructure rollout or innovation?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think I didn't share that on the presentation, but you always have to peel a little bit the data and look at what's behind numbers. Most of the people, when they try to assess progress on EV charging infrastructure deployment, they tend to count in number of charging points. That's one possible metric, but it's a little bit misleading. So if you look, for instance, at deployment across all of the EU, you will see that you have fewer charging points in CEE countries, for instance, but those tend to be higher powered. Okay, so fewer charging point, but the energy that is dispensed, it's faster. Okay, and so if you don't, get a little bit more granular about the data, you're just counting the number of charging points without realizing that maybe, yes, there are fewer charging points in CE countries, but you have more fast charging options, which of course influence the experience of the driver. And so in that sense, even in countries that people traditionally identify as less mature or less developed, you still see a lot of market momentum, a lot of progress. So voila.
So voila. Last question for you. Where do you see roaming platforms or cross-network collaboration, and most importantly, price transparency? What role will they play in the future of EV charging in Europe?
So price transparency is interesting because it's a question that we're really seeing emerging strongly. Not across all markets. We're seeing some clear concerns in Germany, in the Netherlands, to some extent Finland. The framework that I mentioned in this presentation, which is called AFIR, which looks at public charging infrastructure, is going to be reviewed next year, so 2026. The EU is a slow-moving machine, so when you revise in 2026, you work on your revision in 2025, and we do expect that price transparency will be one of the areas where probably the framework that is applicable to public charging infrastructure will evolve. I don't know yet how, but we know there is a lot of pressure from national authorities to see an evolution in the EU regulatory framework, and I would expect to see some changes in 2026.
Okay, so we'll be looking at this again next year, but let's maybe look at now one more time. Before I let you go, Lucie, what's one piece of advice that you'd offer based on last year's industry snapshot?
A piece of advice for whom? Well, our primary stakeholders are EU policymakers. My advice is always make sure that your decision making is evidence-based, because we're making very big decisions about e-mobility these days. There's a lot of ramifications, a lot of consequences for companies who have invested massively into the transition. And so when you make those decisions as new policymakers, make sure you have the data, the expertise, the independent expertise around you to drive your thinking and to drive your decision making. I think that's very critical in terms of a good quality of policymaking in general.
Okay, Lucie, thank you so much for presenting this report, and thank you so much for speaking to us today.